Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me today. My name is Vic Hollins. I'm an art ambassador for Royal Talents, and today I'm going to be going over how to use Ecoline watercolor markers combined with our Bruynzeel watercolor pencils to create a very effective and vibrant pet portrait. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump right into it.
So before I just jump right into doing the demo, I'm just gonna really briefly introduce each of the materials that I'm going to be using today. This is a Rembrandt watercolor block. It's a really high quality professional grade paper. It's 25% cotton and it has a medium grain on it. As you can see, it's glued on all 4 edges, which basically just means that you don't need to pre-stretch your watercolor paper. You can paint right on top of your block and you won't get any warpage as you add water to that paper. So these blocks are really handy. I really love this 5x7 size. We're also going to be using another great product. These are the Ecoline Brush Pens. These are a water-soluble marker that has a really great brush felt nib on it. So we're going to start out with these. Next we have the Amsterdam Acrylic ink. This basically has all the properties of an acrylic, however it's extremely fluid. As a mixed media watercolor artist, I find myself using this in literally every painting. It's amazing. Next we have the Bruynzeel watercolor pencils. These are also a professional grade supply. They have a really great color output, and they're going to be really fantastic for adding lots of details throughout our pet illustration. Last but certainly not least, we have the Princeton Neptune brushes. These are also fantastic, and they're going to be great for the watercolor techniques we're going to be using today. So you can go ahead and start out by sketching your pet portrait directly on top of your block. You can also use transfer paper if you'd like. And I'm literally just going to jump right into using these markers. This gray set is really fabulous. There's a whole range of different grays in there. This cat that I'm going to be painting today has a lot of gray in its fur. Also a couple browns, and I will be pulling those in later. But first we're going to go ahead and move our large round Neptune brush around in the water, because to start out with these watercolor markers, I don't want my brush strokes to be so direct. I want them to be a little bit softer. So I'm actually going to pre-wet the area that I'm going to use these markers at first. And I'm just gonna kind of go section by section. A really effective way to add a lot of life to your pet portraits is by building it up in layers. And by keeping your bottom layers loose, you're gonna end up with an illustration that has a whole bunch of character in it. So I'm gonna go ahead and use kind of this cool gray at first. And as you can see, it has this really fabulous nib on there. You can really get in small places, but you can also hold it almost parallel to the watercolor paper, and it's going to allow you to really fill in a large range pretty quick. If you have not used these before, you'll see that they really do act like watercolor. You can use them like a regular marker and then just add water to blend them out. We will be using that technique later on, so I can show you then. But all of the Ecoline line is really, really transparent, which is great for layering. They're also extremely vibrant. Today we're just going to be using lots of grays and browns. However, if you get the opportunity to try them out, I definitely recommend trying out some of the more vibrant colors that we offer, because they're a lot of fun. You can do much more than just a pet illustration with these markers. So as you can see here, we have a pretty good base with our gray. If we missed any spots, we'll just go back through. But I'm actually just going to take my wet brush at this point and kind of move some of that gray around. I'm gonna soften it up in a couple different areas. I don't want anything to be, at this point, really blocked in or bold looking. We're just kind of slowly building it up. Especially when you're working on fur, it's going to give you the appearance of being really soft, and that is what we are going for. We want our cat to look extremely soft. So I also did this area down here below the nose, and I just did the marker directly on the watercolor paper. So you can see how it didn't spread. You can follow that with a wet brush and just kind of go right over top of it, and it will blend it out. So you see how I kind of have to feather over it a little bit? If you use your marker and then you take your brush and you follow that marker right away, it really easily blends that color outwards. So these are actually a dye-based product. They are not a pigment-based product, which is how they are so vibrant. However, that does mean that these are not light fast, which means that they're going to fade over time. So these are really a art supply that's perfect for illustrators, basically people that are scanning their artwork, lots of tattoo artists, fashion designers, comic book artists, people that just like to draw in their sketchbook. That's kind of what these markers are going to be perfect for. Alright, so the cat kind of has a lot of gray on its face, not so much on the rest of its body. So I'm just gonna kind of stop right here with the gray for now, and put a little bit of a base on the rest of the body. I'll keep this off to the side. We will be coming back to that gray. So the majority of the fur down here is really brown, and then we have some accents of brown on the cheeks and in the nose area. So even if your reference photo doesn't show some of the same colors being used, it is really helpful to use some of the same colors throughout your entire painting. It kind of ties it all together, and in this case, it's going to be very helpful for us. So I just blocked in the body with some water, and I'm gonna kind of do that same technique that we did up top, where I'm just kind of laying in some soft brush strokes. And those are gonna spread out with that water, kind of give it that soft appearance. And of course, if you do your brush strokes and they're not looking soft enough, you might not have enough water on your paper, so you can just go back through with a wet brush, add some more water right on top, and soften them up. They're extremely workable, and because that nib is so durable, I feel okay about kind of scrubbing with it. They're a pretty juicy kind of marker. They have a lot of pigment in them, and the harder you push on the marker, definitely the more color comes out. And again, the markers are just a dye plus gum arabic is the binder, which makes them highly compatible with standard watercolors. So I really like to do a loose watercolor painting and then go back in with these markers for some of the more direct areas that I want to just do some tighter details with, because you can really easily blend these two together. All right, just gonna add a couple more areas. Just by going back over and building it up, we're gonna get some darker shadows in this color. And you can see how the head and the body look really separate right now. Well, I'm gonna go in with my wet brush technique, and I'm going to just wet the paper in the areas where I see the brown again, even if it's already on top of an area that has the gray marker. It won't pick up that gray marker unless you really scrub with the brush. So I know that the gray that I've already put down is safe, But at this point, I'm not really too attached to anything I'm doing. You don't have to be super precise. In fact, as I mentioned earlier, the more gestural that you are, I think the more successful painting you're going to get at the end, because it's going to look a little bit more lively, and I don't really like it so much when the painting is too tight looking, you know, looks too much like a photograph. It's got to look a little bit painterly for me. So I'm going to add a little bit of brown in the ears, and there's not a lot of brown in the reference photo, but in the ears. But sometimes as artists, we kind of just gotta look at our reference photo and kind of make it better. You know, if there's a couple areas where you want there to be brown that there isn't brown, because it's just gonna help tie your painting together, like add it in, you know? Don't let that stop you. It doesn't have to be exactly like the photo. Okay, so at this point I'm not so sure if I have enough brown or not. So the safest bet is to kind of leave it, you know, don't have to overdo it. So I'm gonna leave that one off to the side. Next I'm gonna go in with the pale blue for the eyes. Bandit, this kitty, has really light blue eyes that are so gorgeous. So I'm actually just going to fill in the whole eye with this really light blue. I'm gonna come back in later and add some darker blue, but for now, I'm just gonna start off with the blue base. And instead of painting that background, it's all kind of beige colors that are really similar to the cat. They kind of blend together too much for my liking. So I'm just gonna go ahead and add this light blue into the background. And I'm going to not fill in the whole area because I am gonna go back through with some of this darker blue. And this is where you can tell how vibrant these markers are. When you start getting into the colors, they really pop. Extremely saturated colors. But I can just use this light blue marker to blend into the dark blue and just kind of pull that darker shade downwards. And you can see how we are getting a pretty dynamic blend from that. Now, if that's still too choppy for you, you can go in with that wet watercolor brush with no paint in it, just water, and just blend out those two colors. They're very workable. If you are unhappy with your blend though, you're gonna wanna do it more quickly, because the faster you chase the marker with the water, the softer of a blend you're gonna get. Now I could blend this out with my light blue, but I also wanna show you guys how you can blend it out with that wet watercolor brush. It just takes a little bit more feathering, but as you can see, pretty simple. These truly are like watercolor markers. So I'm just gonna quickly fill in this area over here. And we almost have the base down for our cat. We have almost all of those, you know, mid-tones in place. So if you're doing your own pet portrait, I always recommend starting with those really soft kind of mid-tones. Next, we're gonna add in our darker shades and values, and we're gonna kind of just build it up from there in terms of tightness and in terms of color. So yeah, I'm happy with that background. I think that looks really pretty. So next I'm gonna take that same dark blue that we just used for some of those darker values, and I'm just going to use a little bit inside of the top of the eyes here. And you know, our marker is really nice, extremely concise, so it's really easy to do those tiny strokes in there. And then I'm gonna just go through with a smaller watercolor brush and just feather over it a little bit. I don't want these to blend out all the way because I want that darkest blue to be at the very top of the eye, but I am going to blend that out just a little bit. And you might see this happening I'm gonna pull this up just so that you guys can kind of take a closer look, where it kind of spiders over an area that you don't want. That's no problem. You can always just take a wet brush and kind of do the pickup method, where you're gonna just go over that area by scrubbing it a little bit, and it will just pick up some of that color. And we're gonna be tightening it later anyway, so no big deal. It's okay if it's a little bit looser than you might want it to be. So before I add my darker colors, I am gonna just go through with a pink and a pink kind of beige. Bandit's nose is super pink, which is super adorable. So I'm just gonna fill that in solid. And even though the reference photo does not show any pink, again, I like to put a little bit of pink underneath the eyes and inside the ears. Now that's just like a stylistic choice, but I do think that exaggerating the pink in those two places is something that, you know, adds a little bit more warmth into the illustration. So I'm just using my wet brush here to kind of clean those up, blend that out a little bit, and I'm gonna do the same thing under the eyes. And if you accidentally covered over an area that you wanted to remain white, don't worry, because that's what we're gonna be using our Amsterdam Acrylic ink for later on. It's a really opaque pigment, and it's going to cover over any mistakes that you may have and also brighten any areas up that you maybe accidentally covered over or, you know, just want to work back into and make more dynamic. So that's it for the pink. Let's go in with this pink beige. Any of the areas that I just added that pink around, I'm going to go through with my pink beige and just kind of highlight over top. I don't want it to be too pink because I don't want it to look fake, but I do want this kitty to look super sweet because he definitely is. And I'm going to use a fair amount of this pink beige down here in the fur as well. And again, I'm just really loosely kind of using the side of the marker to get some gestural kind of fur strokes down there. All right, looking good. Perfect. I know it looks weird actually, but as we build it up, it's gonna make more sense. Perfect. So now we're ready to go in with our darker kind of values. I'm not gonna go in with black just yet. That's gonna be later on, but I am gonna go through with this dark brown for Bandit's nose. He also has some dark warm gray throughout the top of his head, and we're going to use these two lighter grays to kind of blend these two darker tones into our cat. This deep gray I'll use for very exclusive little stripes and for around the eyes as well. But you have to remember that our paper is still kind of wet, so ideally you would wait for your paper to completely dry before moving on to this next step. That way your brush strokes are going to be a little bit more concise, but that's okay. We're just going for it today. So I am going to wet the nose for this part. It's really funny how his nose is so brown compared to the rest of his fur. He definitely has this darker brown kind of like near his feet and in his tail and stuff, so it looks a little bit more natural. It looks kind of out of place in this photo though. So one way that we can kind of remedy that is just by putting a little bit throughout in some of the areas. We're just gonna kind of like exaggerate them a little bit and kind of darken those up. And you can see how precise those brush strokes are on the dry paper versus how it kind of looks on that wet paper. So extremely versatile kind of tool. And again, I'm just gonna chase that with my wet watercolor brush. I don't want them to be super precise, but it's okay if they're a little bit more graphic at this point. Okay. Have all that brown in place, looking good. So I'm gonna let that dry up a little bit, and I'm gonna switch over to that warm gray. So he has quite a lot of this warm gray throughout, especially up here, kind of on the side of his head. So one easy tip when painting your pet portrait is to just look at the color you're using and see where you can apply it throughout. Try to stick to one color at a time and plug it into all the places it belongs. That way you're going to end up bringing your illustration forward all at the same point, and that is going to be incredibly helpful because as you create, you will know what your painting needs and what it doesn't need. If you have everything kind of unfinished all at once, you can compare everything and, you know, see what needs to be done, as opposed to having one area completely finished and other areas unfinished. So all of these hairs near Bandit's face are really short and choppy. Right on the bridge of his nose and in the middle of his forehead. So I'm going to apply those in really short brush strokes. If it still looks too graphic for you, you can go through with that wet watercolor brush and soften it up quite a bit. You know, it's really a stylistic choice at the end of the day. I like mine to look a little bit softer, but I don't want to, you know, wash away all the work that I've put in place. So I'm going to keep some of it choppy like that, but I am going to go through with my watercolor brush and hit a couple areas. Now, the more you layer over an area with this marker, the darker it's going to get. So just keep that in mind as you kind of distribute your color throughout. And yeah, as I mentioned, these Ecoline markers are also available in jars. So if you're doing a really large painting and you need to cover a large area, you don't have to use a whole bunch of markers to do that. We do sell the corresponding colors in jars. I believe it's 60 different colors. So there's a whole bunch of different options for, you know, working with these Ecoline products. All right. So before I get too specific with where I'm placing this gray, I want to kind of block in the majority of the larger spots because there's quite a bit of it, and I am going to kind of keep going through and building up this different areas, especially around the sides of the face here. But I have quite a bit of it to do in this area in the center. But however, if I just keep using my marker to make these small strokes, it's just going to look pretty flat. So even though there is a lot of this color in this area, I still want to use other colors to add variety. So I'm going to switch to a cool shade and also do a little bit of layering in that area. And I'm just going to go over top of the areas I already did and kind of blend those out a little bit, layer them as I go, just remembering to do that short, choppy hair look. And you can really see the difference between the wet paper and the dry paper here as well. So let's say you did the bridge of the nose there and it's looking too graphic. You just take your wet brush, scrub it just a little bit, and what that's going to do is really kind of soften that up quite a bit. All right, nice. So while I have this lighter shade out, I'm going to kind of take those darker tones that I just placed for that warm gray and go around the edges of it with this lighter gray. And what that's going to do is just kind of naturally blend those two together. So at this point, my pencil sketch is starting to get a little bit lost in here. As long as you know what's going on, you should be fine. But at this point, if you can't really tell where things are, you may want to switch to your darkest values in that area and place those in there just as markers, so you can kind of know where everything is and kind of work around that. All right, so I'm just gonna add some kind of short, choppy brush strokes here on the part of the face that's underneath the eyes, right on top of that super cute nose. That's also one of the best things about doing pet portraits, is just looking at really cute pets as you go. All right, so I'm also gonna add some of this light gray down here on the bottom of the face. We have a little bit of a shadow, and it just kind of goes into that beige. And I'm going to follow that with my wet brush, blend it in a little bit. This area right here is looking too bold. You know, it's all about edges, and in this stage, we're kind of building up those really soft edges. So don't be shy to go back through and use more water. You might need to go back through and add more color after taking it out. And that's just kind of, you know, how it goes. It's like the push and the pull. And if you're not used to it, you'll get used to it. It's just all practice. So in the ears here, we have some really fine kind of like hairs coming out. Now most of them are really white, but there are a couple darker spots. So I am gonna go through with just the tip of my nib. That felt nib is really wonderful for those short details. All right, looking good. Cool. So I'm using my brush to kind of brush over those really light areas. I don't really want any white of the paper to be left at this point. So I'm just using a wet brush to kind of pick up a little bit of color around that area and just move it over top of the white. This is going to be a really great jumping off point for adding in our darks. And then when we need to put our white back in, it will be more effective. So I'm just going to use my brush here, moves all this beige around. And after the marker is dried, it pretty much is in its place. It does not really budge from where it's placed once it's completely dry. So next here, I'm going through with my warm gray. I'm adding those stripes into this. It's actually his hind leg. It's kind of hard to tell in this photo. It doesn't really matter though, as long as it looks natural in your composition. All people really need to know is it's a striped part of the kitty. And I kind of pulled some of those darker grays that were up in the head down here. You can really see how that kind of pulls it together. This middle part is still a little bit disjointed, so I'm going to go through with this warm gray and really kind of keep adding some more of these darker tones. And again, some of them might be a little bit exaggerated, but at the end of the day, as long as it looks natural, just keep using your reference photo as a guide and exaggerate tones that you can already see. And that should do the trick. So next I'm gonna go through, I'm actually gonna go back through with this really light beige color and just kind of go over some of the darker areas of the brown that we added. This is going to help bridge the gap between those two. And that's kind of, you know, part of it is you don't really have to go completely step by step. I'm only adding highlights at this point. I'm only doing this. If there's an area that you see that you need to go back through and kind of re-plug in some colors, maybe that got wiped away, it's all about the push and the pull. So you can do that at any point. Just gonna keep building up those beige areas. Just little short brush strokes. All right. And then I'm just gonna use my brush, but this time instead of wetting over the whole thing, I'm only gonna focus on wetting the edges And that way my color is going to stay in place, but I get that soft watercolor look that I'm going for. All right. And next I'm going to go through with my dark gray. I'm really only going to use black in a couple areas on the painting, and that's going to be the last watercolor marker step I do. So this deep gray, if you want it to be even darker, just, wait for it to dry a little bit, and you can always go back over top and kind of push more color into those areas. The reason why I don't like to use black all throughout is it makes it look a little bit flat in the shadow areas. If you're using kind of a deep gray throughout, then wherever you put black, it will be very dark. So I normally save that for the pupils, the very center part of the mouth, or the nostrils. Just kind of depends on the lighting and the situation. So adding in these markings really helped kind of give me a little bit more of a layout to compare to my reference photo. So then that way I have a better idea of what colors I need to place before moving on to the next step. And when I paint in this style with these watercolor markers, the majority of the work is done with the watercolor markers. The other supplies are really kind of just a support system for these. But these are going to put in most of the work. It'll basically look like a watercolor painting when we're done with the markers. A unfinished kind of loose watercolor painting, but people would definitely be convinced it could be watercolor. So, all right. And so these areas underneath the eyes are still pretty wet. Ideally, you would let those dry up a little bit, but for today, I'm just going to take a wet brush and kind of feather over them, try to see if I can control that bleed a little bit more. So the areas around the eyes, you want to make sure that those are really dry before you go in and add those kind of water lines for the cats. This is an area that I'll probably go back through with my black and add some really deep shadows in. But you want these lines to be really clean because it's going to give you a really nice juxtaposition against all of that really soft fur that we've already placed throughout. And don't worry if your lines didn't come out perfect, because we can always go back through with our watercolor pencils that we're going to be using later. Those are a really great tool for tightening areas up. Okay, so at least we kind of have an idea of where Bandit's eyes are at the moment. And as you are placing your darker marks, you'll also probably see areas that you want to go back through, and that's great. I always, when I'm placing my darks, like to kind of pay extra special attention to areas that I want to place highlights in, because highlights are the next step after you are done placing your shadows. And I always do like to go back through and make sure that everything looks really connected. So if there's any areas that look like they need to be blended out a little bit, now is the time. So for these little dots that are kind of where the whiskers come off of, if the paper underneath is wet, that's really perfect. You don't want these to be too precise. The more organic and soft they look, the better. And as you can see, the mouth looks really soft right now. It needs a little bit more definition. I'm just gonna add just a tiny bit of that dark right in the center, and I think that's gonna be plenty. So Bandit has a lot of these little dots that are underneath his eye as well. And while my paper is still wet, I'm gonna add those in. It's also going to help build up that darker kind of value that we're missing under the eyes on each side. But at this point, I always like to just kind of look back at my reference photo from a little bit farther away from where you're sitting. You know, you can even stand up. Take a good look at your reference photo and kind of blur your eyes a little bit. Just look at the colors and values that you've already placed and try to be really precise in your speculation. Make sure that you have everything you need, it's looking right, with a couple exceptions of maybe it looking loose. But you're really just kind of at this point focusing on values and tones, making sure all your darks are in place, or if you need to go back through, and sometimes you just have to do that. I'm gonna add a couple darker spots throughout, and then I'm going to blend some of those areas with my trusty warm gray. This is a really beautiful, soft blending color, especially, I'm sure that you could use this almost on every pet portrait. It's really great. And Ecoline does actually also make a colorless blender. I can pull that aside for you guys just so you can see it. Basically, it's just a clear nib. You can use this as a replacement for your wet brush when you're on the go. So extremely helpful. All right, so I'm gonna fill in my pupils here with my little brush pen. And as you can see, you can be super precise with those. So that went great. And I'm going to use my warm gray here just to add in my little final tones. Make sure everything looks how I want it to. If there's areas that need to be just a smidge darker, I am gonna go through and scrub a little bit. As you are painting with your markers, if you see these kind of like little kind of paper marks, they're kind of like little rolled clumps. Don't worry about it. That's literally the paper just coming up. It's not your brush pen being destroyed or anything like that. So the easiest way to get rid of them is once your paper dries, just to kind of wipe them off. All right, and here we are, just adding those softer final tones. I highly recommend, with whatever color you decide to use for your last blending color, just to go through the body, make sure everything looks really good and connected. Especially if you have any of these like hard water lines that formed just because we're using so much water. These markers are really easy to kind of blend those out. And you can always use a wet brush to clean up your edges as well. At this point, we're just worried about having really, really soft edges, with the exception, of course, of the eyes and nose, and the ears we want pretty sharp too. And I am going to add just a little bit more brown into Mr. Bandit's nose. Just using that dark brown, chasing it with the mid-tone brown, and then again with the wet brush on the edges. And that's where we're gonna stop for the Ecoline Brush Pens. All right, so for the next step, let's go ahead and use the Amsterdam Acrylic ink. That way we can kind of reestablish some of those lighter areas that we want to plug back into our painting. Like I was saying earlier, this is a really incredible product. It is highly pigmented. It's going to be great for highlights and also fixing mistakes. It's incredibly versatile, and it's going to be a water-based formula that's waterproof when it's dry. So just like acrylic. It's light fast and non-toxic, odorless. So the Amsterdam Acrylic ink is fantastic. It's actually milled so finely that it can go through a airbrush. You can also put it through, you know, a calligraphy pen. So a lot of different options. Today we're going to be using it just for adding some highlights throughout. So we're going to be a little bit more direct with our brush strokes. We're not going to use water to blend all of them out. We're going to keep some of them pretty chunky. So what I recommend is getting, you know, a round brush and doing short, kind of choppy brush strokes. And of course, this is an incredible product for going over some areas that are a little sloppy that you want to tighten up. I definitely like to put them on my edges. Like this area underneath the eye got way too close just because the paper was pretty wet, so the marker bled. So I'm just going to put this acrylic ink right on top. And for the most part, it does dry pretty opaque. Sometimes you need to go over it once or twice, especially if you're layering over a darker color. And don't worry about it looking too flat, because we're going to add some variety with our Bruynzeel watercolor pencils. I'm going to go through and add some highlights in these little stripies on his forehead. He probably doesn't need them, but I am going to add them just to kind of up the level of contrast. These are, this acrylic ink is really wonderful for doing rim lighting as well. When it dries, it will dry just a little bit less opaque. So if you do lots of portraiture and illustration, I highly recommend trying these out. It's probably my all-time favorite product in the opaque white. And also you can tint that white to be literally any color you want it to be. You can just use standard watercolor and mix it in, or you can combine it with standard acrylic. So it's extremely versatile. All right, so next I'm gonna focus on cleaning some of this brown up down here. There really isn't any brown directly next to his nose. So just go through, and you know, you don't have to cover all of it. It's okay if a little bit peeks through here and there. That's what's gonna add to the charm of the hand-painted aspect of your pet portrait. And down here in the body, I am going to be a little bit looser with how I apply my acrylic. It's basically just really up here in the face where you want to be pretty precise, especially around those really delicate areas, the eyes, nose, mouth. And if your illustration is looking pretty disjointed at this point, that's normal. We are going to be putting in a fair amount of work with the watercolor pencils as well. All right, and down here in the reference photo, we see a fair amount of that rim lighting. And so I'm just going to brush that whole leg. Now that I look at it, I see that I probably could go back with that darker Ecoline marker and kind of reestablish those stripes. And yeah, don't be shy to use this on your edges as rim lighting, just to make really clean, sharp lines. It's, you know, kind of refining it as we go, layer by layer. And I'm gonna add some of those short, choppy highlights that are a little bit, not unexpected, but you want to break up those different tones. You don't want everything to be so blocked in. All of these layers is what's going to make it look very effective, especially with an animal that has so many different values and colors of fur. And those short, choppy brush strokes are going to be really what helps establish it as fur. All right, so we're not going to fully abandon our Amsterdam acrylic ink. We're going to be using it as we go in a couple different areas. But next we are going to switch to our Bruynzeel watercolor pencils. So if you have never used these before, I'm going to just tell you a little bit about them. These are a premium high quality wax-based pencil. They also have a high quality gum Arabic binder, just as our Ecoline watercolor markers do. Compared to other pencils, these are glued all the way around the core. They're actually double glued. So what that means is you're going to have less shattering inside your pencil sharpener. If you accidentally drop your pencil, it's not going to be, the end of the world. I found that these are actually really effective with not shattering. They also have a wide gauge pencil lead, so it's not just going to be all wood. Excellent blendability. And like I said earlier, they're wax-based, which is really great because when you actually draw with them, they kind of feel pearly. I know that sounds weird, but it's almost like it glides across the paper. So I highly recommend trying those out if you have not. Especially if you've never tried watercolor pencils, these are a really good set to start out with. You can use them just like a regular pencil, colored pencil. You don't have to blend them with water if you don't want to, but they're going to allow us to be extremely precise with where we are placing our marks. And then we can go back through later with a wet brush and blend them out. So right now I'm just kind of looking at my pet portrait reference and looking at any areas that really need a darker warm color in that area. And I'm kind of going through there and blocking that in roughly. So for example, for this area down here, I really need to build that up quite a bit more. I'm just going to go back through with my brown pencil, kind of being mindful of that white line that I just placed with that Amsterdam acrylic ink. I want to draw around that, and you can with these pencils because they're so, it's a pencil, you can be as precise as you'd like. But once you have it in place, I'm going to kind of redraw those stripes. You can go back through with a wet brush and kind of just lightly feather over top. You see how it kind of stimulates the pigment that the pencil has placed, gets it nice and wet, and there you have it. You have a really nice blended kind of watercolor look in that area. It doesn't even look like a pencil at all. So we did that same thing with the nose up here. I'm just gonna take my wet brush and go through there. Alternatively, for this area down here, you can go through with a Ecoline brush pen. All of these products really do work together well. So, if you go back on top of it, of course it's gonna output the color that you're using, but you could also use your colorless blender for this section and just use your colorless blender to blend out that watercolor pencil. So you have lots of different options, just depending on what you would like to do. If you're anything like me, you're just gonna use a combination of everything because why not, keep it exciting. So I'm gonna keep going through here with my pencils, just kind of darken a couple areas up. And this is the step where you can really go as in-depth as you'd like. I would recommend really letting your paper dry out all the way before doing this step. These pencils are more effective on a dry surface. Some people do like to use them on the wet surface. However, I find that your pigment release on dry paper is going to be a lot higher with these pencils. And I'm just kind of, as I go over my edge, you don't want to draw a straight line. you know, do some short choppy lines on the edges there to help kind of simulate that fur. All right. So next I'm going to go through with my black pencil, and I'm really going to darken up some of those edges around the eyes. This is going to help establish that these eyes have very sharp lines around them. Not only is that going to draw the viewer's attention to the eyes, which of course we want, but it's also going to help again with that contrast of the fur and make it a more believable pet portrait. So you can really see the difference between this eye all cleaned up and this one that still needs a little bit of work. So I wouldn't go over all of the dark gray that you have placed. I would just go around it, kind of focusing on the edges of the lines. And while we are working on the eyes, I already put some of the dark blue in there. We have the light blue base. I'm going to take my black and add a little bit of a shadow on the top halves of the eyes, since we are going to have a little bit of that fur kind of overhang on top. And that's going to give us a little bit more of a realistic eye. Now, if you look at the reference photo, there's also a little bit of a yellow or kind of a brown tinge. So I am going to lightly put a little bit of brown in there with my brown colored pencil. So since we still have a little bit of really light values of blue in the eye, I'm going to go through with this light blue watercolor marker and just kind of brush over those areas, blend everything out, and make sure that we got everything filled in nicely. And you can always go back through and add more in later, but we are going to add some highlights. So again, a push and pull with our products, but I'm going to go in with my light Amsterdam acrylic ink, and I'm going to just kind of focus on that bottom line right above the black that we've tightened up. You can see that's lightened it up quite a bit. You'll just use your wet brush to kind of brush that white upwards, and it's really going to clean that up. And then of course, you want to add some highlights to your cat's eyes. I like to use the back of the brush for this. Just get a little bit of white on the back end of the brush, and then you can place those highlights. And with this acrylic ink, you may need to wait for that to dry and then go back in and add a little bit more, but that always really helps brighten it up quite a bit. All right. So we're still working on our colored pencils. The next color I'm going to do is going to be this gray. And basically what I'm going to do is just go through this white area here and add some of those choppy short lines in that white area. And what it does is it really breaks up those flat parts, adds a lot of character and texture, adds to the numerous values that we have going on. I'll also want to blend that gray in and out of any areas around the white. But you don't want any of the areas on your cat's face to be really smooth except for the eyes. And that will really help, again, solidify the idea that this is fur. And as you add those lines, you kind of want to go with the contour of the direction that the fur is going. In some areas, if it's not dark enough, you're gonna have to switch back over to your trusty black pencil and add some of those darker ones. I always tend to do this on the bottom of the eye, just because of course there's a little bit of a shadow there, but I really like making the animal's eyes a focal point. And you can kind of push and pull with your colored pencils and your white ink as well. If that line is still too abrupt for you, you can go through, add another layer of little choppy brush strokes on top just to help break it up if it's too monotonous looking. All right, cool. So next I'm going to focus on this kind of mouth area. It's really out of focus compared to the eyes, and we're trying to bring it all up at the same time. So I'm just going to kind of reestablish this area. It all kind of got a little lost down here. So just by using my black watercolor pencil, just doing short little choppy strokes wherever I see shadows. And although I do want to clean it up and add clarity, I still don't want it to be this bold. It doesn't really match the style that we've been doing with really soft lines. So I'm going to go through with my wet brush and soften everything up quite a bit. All right. And of course, I'm also going to focus on this area underneath the head, just by adding a couple extra shadow areas. That way we can really see a good connection point. We know that there's a collar right here. That's going to be something that we're really going to focus on making look nice and sharp. Again, using that black colored pencil is really going to help with that. It's going to be a really easy way to just tighten that up. Even though there is no blue highlight on this collar, I'm going to add one. A little bit of a blue reflection point is going to be really nice. It's going to help tie everything together. And then I'm just gonna go through with my black and I'm going to kind of connect everything. Little short choppy brush strokes all throughout, especially over top of big flat areas like the nose. Just kind of keep looking at your reference photo and make sure that you're really building up those tiny strokes effectively. You can do them going in and out of the large dark shadow areas that you've already placed. If you missed a couple spots, now you can add them in. And as you layer that black over top of that dark gray, you will see that difference in shadow and how that's going to be really effective for just adding more contrast to your piece. All right, so just gonna focus on filling this forehead area in with those short choppy brush strokes. You can add a couple extra into the ears, and I like to use a darker line to add a couple extra outlines near things like the ears, because again, those are gonna be sharp focal points as opposed to the forehead up here. Just going to be a little looser, short furry brush strokes for that area. And you can also, blend over top of areas by just using it like a regular pencil and shading, adding extra value in, if you are looking at your piece as you are tightening it up and you realize that you haven't added enough of a darker tone, that's really the joy of mixed media. You can always go back through and do it. So for one of the final stages, I'm going to be using this warm brown. Again, going through with those short choppy brush strokes wherever they need to be placed. But I'm going to kind of blend this nose area together a little bit more. I'm just by kind of shading this brown upwards and also off to the edges. I want that brown nose to look a little bit more connected. It looks very disconnected right now. And I kind of have like this waterline area happening from the Ecoline watercolor marker underneath. But because I just placed all that brown watercolor pencil on top, we should be able to kind of break that up. And if it's still being stubborn, you can always go back through with your markers and just layer right on top. And of course, you know, that's the thing. I always get too carried away with going back through and just adding more and more. It's a very important thing as an artist to know when to stop, especially with mixed media, because you can really get carried away. Story of my life. Okay, so next we're just going to add some of those darker tones back into the cheeks. Some of those dots that I placed earlier with that dark gray have kind of managed to disappear a little bit. So we're just gonna add those back in. Looks like he needs a little bit more shadowing in this area as well. So now is a really good time to put that in there. You wanna make sure that you have your midtones and shadows dark enough, because we're going to be adding some whiskers as one of our final steps. And if that area is not really that dark where it needs to be, you are going to run into issues of not being able to see the whiskers, which that would just be a travesty. Got to be able to see the whiskers. So I'm just layering those watercolor pencils right on top, adding in some of those short choppy brush strokes just to help blend colors together. It's very effective. And you can also erase these as well. If you're drawing with these, you know, especially on dry paper, it's going to work better. But they really do erase nicely. So they sharpen and erase nice. Okay, so there are a couple areas where normally I'd go through, you know, add a little bit more detail. I think I'm gonna go back in here with some acrylic ink, lighten that up a little bit, and then I'm gonna go through with that brown colored pencil. And, you know, painting a pet portrait like this one is really great because this one in particular has a lot of different brown and gray areas, which is, you know, your warms and your cools. It's a really great exercise for practicing painting with both of them and knowing which one to choose when and how to also blend them together. It's a pretty difficult pet portrait for that reason, but it's a lot of fun. So I will provide the photo reference as well as my line art at the end of the video so that if you would like to paint along with me, you're more than welcome to. Or you can also, you know, apply these own techniques to your own pet portrait illustration. And I'm sure you guys will paint some beautiful things. All right. So next I'm just gonna add some of that brown. I know I keep saying that, but I really mean it this time. And then we're gonna add some whiskers and call it a day. So I have this kind of warm brown and also a cool darker brown. So just to help kind of match some of this really short choppy brush strokes that we have up top, I'm going to do that down here. And that's because the leg is, you know, more in focus. It's right up front. Things that are closer and in focus are more detailed. They have harder edges. You you can see more on them. So I'm going to really focus on making that look very sharp. And yeah, these colored pencils, you can really layer them up nicely. I believe they come in 3 different sets, a 12, a 24, and a 48. But you can also buy them open stock. And they come with this really cool kind of like drawer system where you can stack them on top of other sets that they sell. They have a pastel line, also just a standard standard colored pencil line. But honestly, the watercolor ones are my favorite. They're just so versatile, and you know, if you can add water to blend them out, I think it's just the best. Really perfect for watercolor illustration. All right, so this is the warm brown, and it's a little bit lighter. And I am doing some longer, kind of like looser brush strokes on the chest here. As you can see, it just kind of helps bridge that gap, kind of helps connect that shadow from underneath the chin, downwards and forward. We want that hair to look like it's almost rolling a little bit. And I'm okay with this corner being a little bit loose because that would probably be where I would sign it. And I'm also going to take this warm brown and just hit a couple places on the face just to make sure that I have my browns and grays kind of fully integrated throughout the illustration. And one thing that is really cool that you can do is you can go back through with that really light gray that we used earlier, the really warm light gray, and you can actually, blend a couple of those areas out as well by using that in the short choppy brush strokes, just by going over that brown that we just placed. And that's going to be how you're going to get some really beautiful kind of transitions between the colored pencil and the Ecoline. Just kind of blending that pencil out. This area underneath the chin is a little too dark, so blending that out may not work. Might need to do a little bit of highlight work on that area. And for example, for this area, I would not use my Ecoline watercolor marker to blend it because this Amsterdam acrylic ink is going to, dry waterproof. It might make your nib on your Ecoline pen a little less felt-like. So what you can do is just use a wet brush to blend that out instead. All right, so we're getting to the home stretch here. We definitely need to add some whiskers. And I think I am going to go back through with my dark blue and just add a couple extra little lines throughout the eyes. I want, of course, those eyes to be really captivating. So I always spend extra time adding lots of details, maybe oversaturating them a little bit too, but I just like how that looks. So we're gonna add some grays on top of the lines that we've placed for the whiskers, and those are gonna kind of act as shadows for our next step. So, okay, now that we have all of our colors in place, we're pretty happy with how everything looks. Of course, we can always go back through and add more details, but we're gonna say that this is good, this is where we want it to be. I would just take a script liner. This one is actually a Velvet Touch brush by Princeton. It's a multimedia brush. It's a synthetic, so you can't ever tell how nice it is after you use it until it's wet. This is what it looks like loaded up with product. It's really kind of the perfect tool for things like whiskers. So you're just gonna go ahead and take your script liner and yeah, start putting some whiskers on there. I don't like to have too much paint on my brush because then you're just inevitably gonna get a thick line. But feel free to put a little bit more whiskers than you think that your cat might actually have. A lot of them are gonna get lost anyway. Cats actually have some whiskers off these side areas. And of course, everybody knows that they have them up top on their eyebrows as well. So I'm just gonna keep adding these. And as you can see, this acrylic ink is really wonderful for this. We can extremely easily get lots of whiskers that are very opaque. You can also use your white colored pencil if you'd like to. At this point, my paper is still a little bit too wet to get my white to really give me a lot of payoff. If my watercolor paper was completely dry, I could definitely do that. And then of course now is a good point to kind of go back over any areas that need extra highlights. You can also put some extra highlights into the ears. I like to go through, and if there's any parts of the fur that just need like a little bit of something extra, especially around the edges, this is really a great point to add that in. And as you can see, like we started off with a really loose watercolor sketch, and now we have a really tight watercolor illustration. So I'm gonna hold this up for you guys just to take a look at it, kind of see what we came up with.
Thank you guys so much for tuning in today and painting along with me. Here is our finished product, and I hope that you guys had a really great time and learned a lot. So thanks again, and we'll see you next time.